Hello and welcome to the podcast of FringeArtCulture.com. This podcast aims to enrich the community by focusing on local art and culture. We are your hosts. I'm Grant and this is Alison.
Hi, how you going?
And welcome to episode 5.
On this podcast, we'll be exploring in more depth the topics raised and artists featured on the blog during the month.
But we also want to hear from you. Hit us up on the comments or on our contact page. Let us know what you're up to. We want this to be a community built by the community for the community. We'll be chatting with artists, authors and musicians, sharing with you the best of what we can find in our local community, including author readings, flash interviews with musicians and sets from amateur comedians. And we'll be catching you up on what's been happening and what's coming up in the local area. All this on demand when it's convenient for you via the blog or your podcast provider of choice. Stay tuned later in this episode for a reading from Mitchell Tierney of Chapter 1 and 2 of his work, Ghost Children.
This month we've delved into different concepts of home and what it means to us. We've touched on how arts culture gives us a way to explore what home means, how it's changed, and even what it might feel like to be displaced. We featured Hessam Fratati, an Iranian-born artist who uses satire and assertive symbolism to convey socio-political issues of diaspora and transnational migration. Adam Buchanan also gave us an analysis of Sharon Sherpa's piece called Muted Expression. It's an interesting piece with many layers of meaning. If you go to the Goma Ep05 site, you can find a link to the short video with Sherpa, where he admits to feeling a little bit like a displaced Tibetan nomad. He said despite never having been to Tibet, his identity is wrapped up there because of his Tibetan blood. This is something that his father reminded him of often. So in a way, this work is an exploration of his displacement. If you'd like to know more, jump over to the blog or check out the work in the show notes. We can see within these works that our concept of home or absence of home can be expressed via the relationship between art and place. But home is more than just a place. It might be explained better as an emotional construct relating to places, real and metaphorical. There are many different layers of what we identify as home, and they are all completely subjective. Although our concept of home might have universal commonalities, our personal histories, our identities, and our cultures make it individual to each of us. So our personal or domestic home is one commonly associated with a sense of love from family and friends, a sense of belonging and a sense of safety. These things grant us a stable emotional foundation for our lives now and in the future. If we take one step backwards, we might see a home as being the community or the suburb we live in. It is familiar and endearing, and even if we move away because we wish to expand our notion of home, there will always be that sense of nostalgia associated with a place we've lived in for some time. And then if we continue taking steps backwards and look at the state or even the nation we live in as being home, this notion of home has become increasingly complex, as we mentioned in the feature post, because due to the ease of mobility across the world today, there is a growing trend for people to migrate and bring with them a part of their culture. So they will simultaneously be living and calling two cultures home. This is really evident in multicultural Australia. Then there is also the metaphorical home, the destination we yearn for, in part to grow and find an emotional connection to an intangible space, a place of being, if you will. Although in my experience, this metaphorical home actually becomes the journey itself over time because that intangible place of comfort and safety remains just out of reach. And I often find myself looking back on the journey with that nostalgia, not the place I'm aiming for. People often associate wanderlust with this search for home, the yearning to expand out of their comfort zones to find this sense. But I would also argue that arts culture can be that place or destination that you journey to in order to find home. Because art is as much about the journey. It is as subjective and as nuanced and as universal as all our concepts of home. It can explore emotional elements and make us feel nostalgic, or it might reaffirm our identity of who we are when we are at home and at our most comfortable. It can also push us to think about what it means not to have a home, as in Hessam Fratati's Severed Roots series. You can have a look at this image in the show notes, or there's I think another image of it in our blog post. This is what Hessam says about this series, and I recommend you looking him up as his work is quite poignant. The Severed Roots series is my interpretation of the distress caused through harmful and common global activity of displacement. The Severed trees highlight harmful acts of separation, distress, dilution, and loss of people who have been cut off and forced from their cultural heritage, their motherland, and their geographic place. There'll be an expanded version of that quote on the show notes as well for you. But what Hassam's work does is it highlights the effects of displacement and make us review what it can do to a person. Arts and culture can also contribute to our sense of home through its portability. Cultural practices, that is, the act of creating and sharing, like it might be dance, poetry, paintings, anything that embodies cultural values in and outside our community. These all contribute by enriching our knowledge of the people around us and by furthering our individual and collective sense of identity and citizenship or belonging, which, like I said, is some of the foundations of what we call home.
Then there's the transcendent idea of home, a spiritual other world, such as heaven, that people aspire to through rituals and practices. This is the kind of thing that people tend to bring with them wherever they go. That's the kind of thing that people can hold on to when they're displaced from their lands. It's like the roots of their culture that they can that are portable.
Yep.
Some religions, such as Gnosticism and some types of Buddhism, see life as a corrupted and transient existence, separate from our true home where our spirit joins back with the one consciousness. The desire to return to this transcendent home drives behaviours within those traditions to make it more likely that they would return there, or that they believe that they would. This transcendent home can be identified as heaven itself, where our spiritual bodies never degrade, but they still somehow represent that which lived its life on earth. So there you see there's two different concepts of how how it affects, how that transcendent idea of home affects life after death. So if you remember, if you've ever seen The Matrix, a lot of people have seen The Matrix, and the character of Neo. So in the part where he returns to the source, that's kind of the idea of, that's really Gnosticism actually. It's a cross between Buddhism and Gnosticism, because in Gnosticism there's the idea that everything happens cyclically, like over and over, like the manifestation of our spirit here on earth happens again and again in a cycle. That's why the character of Neo keeps appearing in the Matrix, as opposed to the monotheistic religion's concept of heaven as being a transcendent home where the soul either returns to, in the cases of pre-existent souls, or ends up after the life on earth.
I found this interesting piece on the Neos Cosmos blog where Edward Spence, a senior lecturer of philosophy and ethics from the Charles Sturt University, wrote that Socrates and Plato believed that philosophy itself was the preparation for death, a welcome release to freedom, if you will, or I guess it was for them their true home was the world of eternal ideas, which was their transcendent home, the realm of the good and the beautiful.
Yeah, because they were always talking about the transcendent metaphysical archetypal, like in their heaven there is a chair that is the perfect chair, that is the epitome of what a chair is.
Yeah.
Like that's the kind of weird stuff, like all of the forms, like the circle and a sphere
in that
and a
realm,
square,
as thinking beings we should consider our ultimate and true home. By contrast, this is a perishable world full of fleeting sights and sounds, as no more of a shadow of our true home, that kind of thing. It's merely an anteroom.
Yes. They were so idealistic.
I know. And this is what Socrates tells us by the way of myth in another of Plato's dialogues, that of Phaedrus.
And religion and war also affect our conception of home. So sometimes it's in negative ways, like who you are in relationship to where you are. These influences contribute to feelings of nationalism, and they can strengthen a person's ties or affinity to a people and a place, and how we identify and belong to a place of war, or the theatre of war, like a place where war is consumed, a place like Syria or somewhere like that. So you get tremendous amount of people fleeing the area, but then you have others that remain behind for out of some strange strange tie with the place, so that they still see it as home, even though it's just a pile of rubble, basically. Well, there's actually a paper done. It's called "Mental Health Consequences of War: A Brief Review of Research Findings," and I've put the link in the show notes if you'd like to have a quick look. I think it looks like it's a free to access paper, so it's not paywalled by the look of it. And I'll just read the abstract for you quickly. So, among the consequences of war, the impact on the mental health of the civilian population is one of the most significant. Studies of the general population show that a definite increase in the incidence and prevalence of mental disorders. Women are more affected than men. Other vulnerable groups are children, the elderly, and disabled. Prevalence rates are associated with the degree of trauma and the availability of physical and emotional support. The use of cultural and religious coping strategies is frequent in developing countries.
I think it's important too when we look at transnational migration, where you've got people who come to Australia, especially in Logan, there's lots of them, lots of people who have come over and they've brought, parts of their culture with them, and they, they practice at home and they bring it to their workplace and all that kind of stuff. But they also participate in culture back home at the same time. So they're, participating in two different cultures. And as an Australian who doesn't have much else as far as my culture goes, I think it's important to embrace that and really incorporate it into your sense of home. And in order, by doing so, what you're doing is giving a level of acceptance to those people. And I think, it becomes hard when there's lots of different cultures, but what we tend to do is just isolate ourselves as far as our home goes to something we feel most comfortable. But yet we don't know what else feels comfortable unless we try.
Yep, and that's exactly what all of this crazy BS with Pauline Hanson and all that sort of stuff, it makes me sick. It's because it's really just jingoism. It's I don't know that other thing and I don't want my thing to change. And that people are using Muslim migration as a dog whistle. That's all it is. Because you have people like Walid Ali, and there's there was a guy actually on, I can't remember his name, but he was actually on Q&A with Pauline Hanson, and I don't know if she was playing dumb or whether she just is dumb. I don't want to assert anything over her, but she didn't seem
She's
to...
ignorant. I don't think she's learnt. She hasn't made the effort.
No, but
from everything that I can tell.
I think that there's a lot of right-wing talking points that get thrown around, and if you are comfortable with an idea that hits you, that's true, then there's no need for you to go and searching out the truth if you're not inclined to. And that's what happens with these people.
Yeah.
It's they hear the first thing that they hear, and then they like...
Because really what ends up happening is those people come over here in search of, another home, because they, depending on why they come, whether it be forced migration or not, it doesn't matter. The point is that you need to have home wherever you go. You need to be able to feel comfortable. You need to have a sense of belonging and all that kind of thing. And if that gets fractured from, racism or, rejection from the people that you've gone to live with, it has a big impact on you. You can isolate yourself to a certain degree to people who are like-minded or from your culture here. But all that does is create different cultural groups that stick together and don't ever band out. And then they ends up, that's what forms conflict, because you end up with people being defensive quite easily of their position because they've had to defend themselves. And people, it's like when someone, says something nasty about your kids. As a parent, you automatically get your back up, regardless of whether your kid did the wrong thing or not. Do you know what I mean when I say that?
Yeah.
You kind of have you end up on the defensive for your own culture that's not necessarily from here. I mean, this is all my experience. But
Yeah, I think it's definitely a matter of cultural assimilation is a generational thing. So you'll have like the first generation come from an area, and it's hard to change somebody's mind about cultural practices. It's unless someone like, because there's a lot of the time you get this whole, oh well, they came here so they have to change, and like, well, who says that the way we do it here is the best way or the perfect way? And yes, it's our way at the moment. It's the way we happen to do things, but why couldn't some other way be better?
isn't that just a really hard thing to think of, though, as an Australian? What is our way?
Yeah, I know. That's the other crazy part.
Like,
Because
we're so new when it comes to having a cultural identity, because it's all been, crazily mixed up with colonialism and indigenous
yeah,
violence and
are we
misinterpretation.
English? Are we European? Are we?
Yeah, and that's the thing. There's so many of us from all different cultures now that our home needs to incorporate everything, and we've really fractured our indigenous cultures idea of home. It's been awful.
Yeah, I think that there's so much of that that's been lost and it would be really hard to actually bring any of that back in a really big way. I think
I think though, as generations go on, and
it's never going to be the same as it was, but it might be something different to what it is now that might include a bit more
my hope
of the traditional stuff.
Yeah, my hope is that, the hi, sorry, that's my cat. My hope is that as our this generation and the ones beneath us, we grow up, we kind of supersede the old way of thinking, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And that's the only hope you can have, that the ideas that we actually question ideas that come to us from our parents and our parents' parents about the way things ought to be, and we actually
And I
look
really hope
outside
that,
that sphere and
our children do the same to us.
yeah.
That's what we really need to be teaching our children. How do you identify your home, and is it something that ever expands and ever continues? And
And does it change culturally? Can home change culturally in its current location? Is that okay, or does it have to stay static and just evolve slowly? And like, because you still
continue to
find,
question it.
yeah, cities are always more multicultural, and traditions change so much more quickly in cities than out in countries. It's actually, they've noticed it in linguistic traditions as well, and as well as like folk stories. You tend to find that a folk story that ends up in a city will actually morph quicker than it will in a country area. Country
Population
areas,
density.
yeah, because of the population density, because of the melting pot of different ideas, because folk traditions tend to be very malleable and actually prone to influence by different stories, and because of the people that they're being told to and what message they need to give.
Yeah, the context.
The context. There's so much around like the beginnings of things like Christianity that people think are, oh well, it's just, it was just the Jewish tradition and then the Christian tradition. That's how it goes, isn't it? No, that you had all of this stuff in Rome and all of the traditions that came through them, and all of the Babylonian traditions and all that sort of stuff in this period of time that they called the Hellenistic period, and it caused this melding of all of these different ideas together. And it's hard to tell where each one came from because there's so much that happened, but there's more rural areas around there where they think
more insular.
Yeah, more insular, and they kind of keep their traditions stronger.
But I guess it's easy to see how people identify with a religion as being home, because that religion makes them feel, there's a sense of community in that, which is, where the same thing I feel about art and culture. It makes me feel at home because it enables me to question, my existence and everything else as well. And there's such a vibrant community when it comes to all the artists and the people who come into it, engage in art and all that kind of thing. It's the same sort of thing. And I think, as Alain de Botton, I love saying that, has said in the past, art and culture is fast becoming the secular world's place, like religion or scripture, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I like some of the ideas that he has around that sort of thing. Like the idea, I really like the idea of everyone getting together and talking, having somebody almost give a sermon, but reading from some philosophical texts and then pulling something out of it and then making it applicable to the here and now. Like I don't need any, promises of, if you do this, something great will happen, but just saying,
It's always done in a context that makes you want to ask more questions. Do you know what I mean? That's what I like about philosophy. It's not about preaching to a set way of thinking. It's about telling you about how people have thought about things in the past and how, if that applies to your life today, what questions might that make you ask?
yeah. Yep.
It's not, oh, now you need to think like this.
Yeah.
If you thought like that, what effect would that have on your life? That's, stoicism. If you got up in the morning and your mantra was to accept that things might go wrong that day, or things might, people might hate you, or you might get abused, and you have to be acceptive of that and just kind of, wash it off, like a water off a duck's back, just accept that in the morning. That's an awesome way of thinking, and people aren't just saying you should just not feel ever, but they're saying that if you are accepting of that, then it will actually, have other effects on your life.
Yeah. What is it? There's a part of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. It basically says, you'll come across people today who will be arrogant and will be assholes, and they'll say things about you and they'll stab you in the back. But it's just another day, and you're just going to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Basically, it was really kind of, the world is the way it is, and people are the way they are.
If you care less, you will be happier.
Yeah. Yep. That doesn't, it can't stop you from doing what you have to do, what your role is. Because
as humans, we tend to get bogged down in the details of what matters and what doesn't. It's the same thing with home. If you have this idea that's fixed, and it's very rigid of your idea of home, and you never question it, and you'll go through life never quite obtaining that, I think. Like, you'll have this idea that might have been so from your childhood that you really just want to get back to, and you'll spend your whole life trying to recreate something that you're never going to be able to recreate.
Yeah, that's where disappointment comes in. If you're expecting something to be a certain way, or just imagine something happened that meant that your home, the way it was, couldn't be that way again, then if you dwell on that sort of thing, if you don't have a malleable idea of home that kind of is portable and can change and can new ideas can feed into it, then you're going to be disappointed by the outcome.
I just want to make a disclaimer here as well. Although there are some works and some fiction and whatever claims to be consciously exploring the concept of home or displacement, there are other works or genres such as utopian or dystopian fiction that explores notions surrounding our world, or at the very least our society at large. And even though we can make a conscious link to what it says about our home or the author's home, we need to remember that by doing so, we may have made a link that may have not been the artist's or the author's original intention. So what this is it's actually what art and culture is all about. Grant and I were discussing this earlier when we were preparing for this podcast, and he was concerned that by making these sometimes tenuous links between concepts and different works, that we were essentially clutching at straws for ways to tie the two themes together. But what I wanted to add here is that the way we interpret any creative work is subjective. Our ability to pull abstract concepts from different works is what makes art so valuable. For example, like I said, if we look at the transcendent idea of home, one that might personify a heaven-like quality, it might bring us to utopian fiction. So Wikipedia, just so that we've got a proper definition, says that utopian fiction as a genre is one that portrays a setting that agrees with the author's ethos and is portrayed as having various attributes that readers often find to be characteristic of that which they would like to implement in reality. Essentially, it's the authors, or most likely the readers as well, their ideal version of reality. So dystopian fiction is the reverse. It is something that that they would like to avoid becoming their reality. So, often characterized by fear and the impending or current socio or political issues often arise as part of that reality. We can see then that our concept of home, love, belonging, security, all those things are all part of what it would mean to embody our perfect reality. It is our ideal home, and a fear of losing those things or having already lost them embodies a dystopian fiction. So we can ask then, what happens when we don't have a solid foundation of home? If home is something that's fractured and it's never been, if you've grown up in a place that's never been safe or secure or made you feel like you can be you, or you don't have a sense of identity. And I've heard of people talking about this one lady who grew up in New York City. She got married. She was studying. She had a well-paid job. And one day she just turned around. She divorced her husband. She quit her job. She threw away her PhD. She sold all her stuff. And she got on a plane and flew to South America. And she said when she got there, she realised that New York City was never her home. It never meshed with her. And I guess a lot of people feel that way. There's lots of forced migration because of, war and conflict across the world. But without there being violence or whatever in the home, when you're just trying to make sense of the world, I guess it comes into all sorts of things. You could bring it right down to the level of being not feeling at home in your own body, or your own gender.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, like gender dysmorphia and stuff like that. But I think it's interesting just thinking of that lady. I wonder how much of that can be post hoc. Like, okay, she might have just been unhappy in her situation. And like, I've heard stories about on the Tim Ferriss podcast, which is excellent. Everyone should listen to it, about people who have become journalists who basically do that sort of thing. Like there's this one guy, he's actually, he ended up working in the invention kitchen for one of the celebrity chefs that they have on MasterChef. On the show, he's always got all those really fantastic ideas, like using dry ice and liquid nitrogen and stuff to do these really interesting things. Well, this guy was the guy that actually started that. So he was studying a PhD and he decided that he was going to go and become a chef. And he ended up in this
There's a lot of math in cooking though. Do you know what I mean? There's a very
rigid
logical
structure of time,
logical sequence of things. So I guess it's sort of, it's kind of, it's a leap because it's, yeah.
It's definitely, jumping out of, he just didn't feel like that thing that he was doing was right for him. It was just following a path, but he needed to just jump out and do something else. So the idea of,
I guess it depends on how you describe home to yourself.
Yeah.
Because I think, you look back in the Middle Ages or whatever, where we couldn't travel especially from Australia, but
traveling around Europe,
from country to country was a lot harder. So, and wars were fought in different ways, and conflict was handled differently, and socio-political, that was all different. So you were really tied up with like a sense of home that you identified with your nation. It was, less about, because, your nation was what supplied you with your safety and your security, and you had to be loyal to them in order to get that back. So
Yeah, whereas in
These
the
days, we're, as far as technology and everything goes, we're more kind of fend for yourself. We still have our
well,
government system is in place where,
yeah, we're world citizens,
yeah,
and I think we also
I guess
that allows us to think a bit more in a worldly sense as far as things like climate change and stuff like that. We can identify with other people around the world. We aren't so insular. And I
yeah,
think there probably was a lot of really insular thinking in those times when you didn't know
yeah,
what everyone else was like. Like, I've heard stories about there's parts of China where they still believe a lot of the propaganda, like the elderly people, still believe a lot of propaganda about the West and like America and stuff that they were being told back in the 60s and 70s. Like, oh, they've all got these terrible diseases and stuff because they're immoral and all this sort of thing. But whereas like the younger people are like, yeah, it's just it's the rest of the world, and everyone's kind of attitudes are so much different because they know more. They're able to know more about other people all around the world.
we're growing up now in a world where we're expected to get to our early 20s, or, mid 20s, early 30s, whatever, and want to travel and want to expand our notion of home to be not just, there's so many more of us anyway. So, back in my parents' day, their notion of home was quite insular, even though, we still had a fairly mobile society. It's not as mobile as it was now, but it wasn't, you were expected to get out of the hometown you were in, which in my parents' case was like Goondiwindi, and go to Brisbane and expand that way. But that was the extent of it. You weren't expected to get on a plane
Overseas.
and, even careers these days where you get on and go to conferences all around the world to speak rather than just the next city or the next town.
Yeah. And now I'll share with you what's been going on and what's coming up. The Music Cavern Beenleigh had their monthly Saturday morning concert in Beenleigh Town Square this past weekend. So look out for the next one of those by keeping an eye out on their Facebook page for details. They also have a new weekly live YouTube stream every Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. where Jesse Nikolic and Johnny Breaker talk about music and show off some local talent. I think they're up to episode 7 so far. Running from the 6th of August until the 15th, Logan Artists Association present the Anything Goes Members Exhibition. This exhibition features mixed media work from Mark Davies, Ria Willering, Kathy Tranter, and Chris Estridge. The art gallery is open from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., and you can check out the Facebook page or their website for details on the location.
There's a few images on our site too. We were there on Saturday, checking it out and saying hello.
Also, Wayne Budge, local artist from Tanamira, I believe, who we featured on the blog previously, is just had some work featured at an exhibition in San Diego this month, which is very exciting for him. If you missed his work when it was at the Logan Art Gallery, it's currently being exhibited at the Boona Regional Art Gallery, and we've got some details for that in the show notes. And now, as promised, here's Mitchell Tierney's readings of his work, Ghost Children, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2.
Chapter 1. Gwendolyn stood staring up at the house. The timber was pulling away from the crooked and rusted nails. The paint had all but peeled away like sunburnt skin, flaking on the overgrown grass and weeds. The glass in the front windows were smudged by grease or oil. The frames were rotten and turning to compost, littering the front balcony with decaying wood. Several tiles had fallen from the roof and lay in front of her. Gwen stared at them. She had a vivid flash of one falling on her head, striking her hard, knocking her unconscious. She put her foot on the first step, and it creaked louder than it should have. Even the little weight she put on it, it felt like it would crumble under her. She skipped the first step and jumped up onto the second, quickly running up the remainder till she reached the balcony. The front door had red and green stained glass. It appeared to be the only thing about this house that was still intact. She gingerly approached the door and turned the handle. It moaned and snagged on the floorboards. Slowly she slid in and shut the door behind her. The house was dark. Darker due to most of the windows being boarded up or covered in newspaper. She was looking down a long corridor that ran from the front of the house to the kitchen, to the rear. There was a faint square under her feet from where a rug had once been, but had been eaten by mice or turned to dust by time. The room to her right had a large vacant area with a fireplace. A small grill sat, crooked and covered in ash. A chandelier hung from the ceiling. All the bulbs and candles were missing. Long spider webs hung from each arm, the gold-plated paint slowly dropping off onto the ground like snowflakes. Gwen looked to her left and saw the lounge room or sitting room. A sofa was placed at an odd angle, not facing the wall where a TV or radio would have been, but facing the hallway where she stood. A small red plastic ball sat on the lounge. It looked out of place amongst the white and brown of the wallpaper and floor. A thump came from upstairs and her eyes looked up, not in surprise but in curiosity. A small dust cloud floated down from the ceiling in front of her. "It's just me," she said. Her voice was soft and delicate. She made her way through the hallway into the stairs at the back. There was an archway where another spider web hung. There was no spider in it. Only the sack of one of its cocoons with a dead fly remained. She looked up the stairs. It faded into complete darkness. There was movement from the top of the stairs, but it was too dark to see. Shuffling of small feet and giggling. Gwen smiled. "They came back," said a child's voice. "Who did?" Gwen asked the empty staircase. "The men," said a girl's voice. "The ones from before?" Gwen responded. "Yes, and others, too," a boy's voice said meekly. "They came inside." "What did they do?" There was no reply. Suddenly there was a sound of smacking wood, and Gwen turned to see the red ball bouncing into the hallway. It rolled near the front door and stopped. "We'll play in a minute," she said. "First I need to know what they were looking for." "Measuring rooms and..." The boy spoke, then stopped. "They tapped the walls and shook the pipes." There was no for sale sign out the front. Maybe they were just looking around. Gwen looked down at her feet, and the ball was swaying softly between her legs. She leaned down and picked it up. "There were 2 cars," another girl's voice said, sounding slightly older than the first. "They got out and laughed at our house. We didn't like that." "No," Gwen replied. "I wouldn't either." She looked up the stairs and could see a shoe dangling over the top step. It was almost see-through. "Where's Frederick?" "I'm here," came a voice, older again than the first boy. "Why haven't you spoken yet?" "I don't have anything to say." "Come down here then," Gwendolyn said. "We'll play for a while. I have to go soon. It's getting dark." 2 small feet slid onto the first step. The shoes were white and done up with lace. The socks had frills, and the stud of the dress emerged. The first child, a small girl, took several steps down the staircase, one of her small hands gripping the railing. The skin was translucent, and she hovered slightly. Her grin was wide, and she saw Gwendolyn. Behind her was a boy, smaller than her. He wore a vest with silver buttons. His hands were at his side, and he floated, rather than stepped down towards the bottom floor. Gwen felt the chill on her arms and legs, and the ball was knocked from her grip. It bounced into the kitchen where a young man stood. He wore a hat, a driver's cap, and one of his eyes was shut. He picked up the ball and looked at Gwen. "I don't know why they used the stairs," the older boy said. Around Gwen was a young girl, another one slightly older, both wearing wavering dresses. A small boy stood closest to her, trying to grip Gwen's jeans. "Frederick, we still like to feel alive sometimes," the older girl said. "Well, Emily," Frederick snapped, "we aren't. And that's all there is to it." "Be quiet, Frederick," Gwen said to him. "Now, what do you want to play?" Ghost Children, Chapter 2. A thunderclap had made the librarian scream. It lit up the massive building with blinding bright light. Her hand was on her chest and her eyes became watery. She looked at Gwen standing in front of her. "Sorry, dear," she said at a whisper. "That scared me half to death. What is it that you're after?" "Murders," Gwen said, holding out a piece of paper. Around the year 1880, child murders. The librarian took the piece of paper from her and looked at it. On it was written 4 child names: Frederick, Emily, Sven, and Gertrude. And the last names? No last names. The librarian didn't speak for a few moments. She looked at the piece of paper in her hand. It had a smattering of coffee in the corner. She typed the names and date into a computer, then nodded and looked up at Gwen. There's a microfiche of newspapers from that era. You can look through those, but it may be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Gwen took the piece of paper from her. Can you show me where it is, please? As they walked the aisles of old and dusted books, another lightning strike flashed outside. The lights flickered for a moment. They both looked up and saw the fluorescent bulb stammer and come back to life. It's at the back here, in a room. No one ever comes back here. Most things are on the internet now. What time do you close? The librarian stared at Gwen. In 2 hours. She unlocked the door, and inside the room was a microfiche machine with a large metal cupboard. It's organized by year, the librarian said, waving her in. I have to get back to my desk. The power switch is over there. Good luck. Gwen sat and turned the machine on. It hummed to life, and a small green screen started to glow, filling the room in an eerie ambience. She pulled the first fish container out and searched through the years. She pushed it back and ran her finger down the columns until she neared the bottom. It was rusted, and she had to yank it hard to free it. The first tab was titled 1880 to 1899. She placed it gently on the table and started to go through them one by one. The newspaper print was small, and her eyes started to hurt. The one she had looked at, she put to her right. Slowly over the hour, the stack got higher and higher. There were few murders in that area around the 1800s. She came across one article that even mentioned the plague. The small room became cold, and Gwen knew she was running out of time. She had only gone through a third of the container when she stumbled upon their headline. Children slain at home residence. Father suspected. She zoomed in on the article. 4 children were found murdered in their home at Oak Ridge County at 4:35 p.m. yesterday morning. The children were dressed for church and found by a neighbor who would give them a lift every Sunday. The children's mother had left the family 3 weeks prior. Police are asking anyone for information on the whereabouts. The bloody knife was found in the well in the back garden. The child's father, who police are reluctant to name, has yet to be located. Gwen pushed away from the desk. The pit of her stomach felt heavy. She looked at her hands, and they were shaking. There was a light knock on the door, and the librarian stood there, her bag over one shoulder and keys dangling from her fingers. I'm sorry, dear. I've left you as long as possible. I have to close up now. Gwen stood. She was lost for words. She turned the machine off and gathered her things. You look like you've seen a ghost, the librarian said, showing the door as they exited the building. Gwen gave her a smile and thanked her for her time. The rain was heavier now, and the streetlights scattered the small town in front of her. She began to walk, her mind frazzled from the article. She wondered how she was going to tell the children.
Thanks again for being with us, and as a reminder, leave your comments about this episode on the blog, Twitter or Facebook. Share the podcast by sharing the Twitter or Facebook post for this episode, and if you like what we're doing and you want to get involved, hit us up on the contact page. See you next time.